In 1980, pensions hit an all-time high in America, with nearly half of all private sector workers covered, and that high was a result of 4 decades of steady pension growth. But after 1980, something happened. Coverage began to decline sharply, and by 2023, only 15% of private sector workers had a pension. Which raises the question, what happened to the pension? Well, many people would say that the answer is simple. Corporations got greedy, politics got corrupt, and the middle class got left behind. And although there's a lot of truth to that, the real story goes much deeper. The story of the vanishing pension is far more complex and surprisingly fascinating than you would ever imagine. It's a story that spans over 150 years, starting in the industrial age, when an industrial giant used pensions to control their workforce, to later be used as a wartime tool to attract workers as wages froze, to then grow into the golden age as unions fought to cover millions. But from there, it slowly started to unravel, with monumental bankruptcies, improper managements, mob-tied union leaders, government regulation, changing American rhetoric, Wall Street booms, corporate scandals, Wall Street busts, more Wall Street busts, eventually leading us to where we are today, where pensions are merely a relic of the past. Pensions didn't just vanish overnight, but they unraveled slowly, over decades, in a long, complex story. And in this video, I want to tell you that story and talk about how private pensions came to America, how they grew into the backbone of retirement for nearly a century, and how they ultimately collapsed to be replaced by the 401k. Now, in order to understand how it all went wrong, we first must understand how it all began. And in order to do that, we need to go back in time, over 150 years ago, with Chapter 1, the birth of the corporate pension. Now, 150 years ago, America was in its infancy, and pensions, or just retirement in general, wasn't yet a thing. Most people worked until they couldn't, died young, or relied on family to survive, and there also weren't any companies big enough or wealthy enough to offer a pension. But that would all change in 1875, when the first ever private company would offer a pension plan, and that company was called the American Express Company. And yes, the credit card company American Express. But back then, American Express wasn't yet a credit card company, but they were a freight and shipping company, moving goods, parcels, and even currency across the country by rail. And as American Express was becoming this industrial giant, they needed to attract highly skilled workers, and in 1875, they offered America's first ever private pension plan, and this is how it worked. If you worked for the company for 20 years, by the time you turned 60, you were eligible for their pension, which was 50% of your annual salary, a maximum of $500 a year. And as generous as that sounded, in many ways, it was too good to be true, because in 1875, the life expectancy was only 43 years old. The pension could be revoked at any time. You had no legal protections to your pension, and in order to receive it, you had to be recommended by your manager and approved by a board of directors. American Express wasn't offering a pension plan out of generosity, but it was a business strategy to create a loyal, career-oriented workforce, retain workers, and phase out the old workers. However, as America industrialized, other corporate giants like AT&T, General Electric, and many others took notice and started offering pension plans, which would set the stage for decades of growth. And by the 1920s, the government started to take notice and passed legislation to incentivize companies to offer pensions. In 1921, Congress passed a Revenue Act that allowed companies to deduct contributions to pension funds, lowering their taxable income. And in 1926, they passed another act that allowed pension fund investments to grow tax-free, even when investing in their own company's stock and bonds. And by the late 1920s, pensions were no longer this rare experiment, but they were an effective tool used by American industry to retain workers while getting financial kickbacks. And as we move forward in time, pension plans would explode and become a common worker benefit. And let's talk about that in Chapter 2, the golden age of pensions. By the 1930s, pensions were gaining momentum, even as the Great Depression sent shockwaves through the economy, closing many companies and wiping out their pension plans. For the firms that survived, pensions became a powerful promise, a symbol of stability in an unstable time. And by 1940, 15% of the private workforce had a pension plan, though most benefits were to managers and executives. However, as we move through the 40s, they would begin to expand rapidly. You see, at the time in the 1940s, America was fighting in World War II, and inflation was starting to become a big problem. In an attempt to stabilize the economy, Congress passed the Wage and Salary Act of 1942, which froze wages for most workers, meaning companies could not raise salaries beyond a certain point without government approval. Which is not ideal for running a business, but there was a loophole in this law. It didn't limit something called fringe benefits, meaning although companies couldn't offer higher pay, they could offer more generous perks like health insurance, paid leave, and pensions. And because of this, more and more companies started to offer pensions as a way to attract workers. And when the war ended, this boom didn't stop. America's economy was growing rapidly, and companies were using pensions as a way to attract talent. And at the same time, labor unions were at the height of their power, with 1/3 of all American workers in a union. And pensions became this big bargaining chip where union workers went on strike to receive pensions. And in 1949, the UAW won a monumental victory with Ford Motors, agreeing to a $100 a month pension after age 65 and 30 years of service. And this sent a domino effect throughout the system. 24 hours later, the House of Representatives raised Social Security for all Americans. After 104 days of striking, Chrysler agrees to a pension plan. And in 1950, General Motors agreed to a pension plan, and this spread to other heavily unionized industries. And even non-union industries followed suit to remain competitive and prevent unions from coming in. And the numbers started to boom, going from 15% covered under a pension plan in 1940 to 25% in 1950 to 41% in 1960. Pensions became the industry standard. However, of course, there were some flaws to this. Small firms, women, and minorities were often excluded. And also, it implied you stay at one company your entire career, so if you left, you forfeited the pension. But perhaps the biggest flaw in the system was that these promises were held under the assumption that these businesses would survive long enough to pay out the pension. And business doesn't always work out this way, and it was only a matter of time until all of this would come crashing down. And so let's talk about that in Chapter 3, Studebaker, Hoffa, and Regulation. We have now reached the climax of our story. Pensions, as great as they sounded, were just a ticking time bomb, and the first spark would go off in 1963. You see, at this time, the American auto industry was dominated by three giants: Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. But there was also a fourth player, Studebaker, known for its stylish cars and loyal workforce. But by the early 1960s, Studebaker was struggling to compete, with internal mismanagement and financial troubles appearing. And by December 1963, the company shut down its factory in South Bend, Indiana, putting thousands out of work. But these people didn't just lose their jobs, but they also lost their pensions. You see, Studebaker's pension plan was severely underfunded. They acted as if they would stay in business forever. And so they expected that as the business grew, they could keep paying out pensions. However, when business closed, they were unable to fund their pensions. And although some people still got their pensions, many people got fractions of it, while others got nothing. And this sent shockwaves throughout the country because people realized that this could happen to them too. And if their company went out of business, they too could lose their pension. And at the same time, there were some scandals going on with union pension funds. One in particular was the Teamsters Central State Pension Fund ran by Jimmy Hoffa, who used part of the money to fund some questionable real estate investments in Florida, as well as gave loans to mobsters who ran casinos in Las Vegas. And Jimmy was sent to prison, but years after getting released in 1975, well, Jimmy went missing and was never to be seen again, although some people speculate that he was killed by the mob and his body was disposed in a meat grinder. Others believe the mob buried his body in cement near the Giants Stadium. But 50 years later, and nobody knows what actually happened to Jimmy Hoffa. Anyways, this made people realize that these unions that were supposed to be looking out for them could also be corrupt. And in addition to Studebaker, there were many other companies that either got rid of their pension plans or were unable to pay them out. And another problem that arose was these pension plans often required you to work 20 to 30 years before getting a payment. And many companies started firing employees right before they were eligible to receive the pension to protect their bottom line. It was a disaster. And like all disasters, eventually, the government had to step in and start creating regulations in order to try to create stability and certainty. And in 1974, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act was created that established minimum funding requirements, required more company transparency, more worker protections, and federal insurance if the company went under. And on paper, this was supposed to save the pension. However, it came with an unintended consequence. Pensions became a huge financial burden for companies. But in the 1970s, a new idea emerged in the tax code, and it was located in Section 401, subsection K, later to be known as the 401k. And so let's talk about that in Chapter 4, the 401k revolution. Now, the 401k wasn't designed to change retirement in America, but of course, it was created to allow rich people to defer taxes. They would get extra money like a bonus, put it in a special savings account where it could go tax-free. But by 1980, a man named Ted Benna spotted this and realized that this could be used for ordinary workers too. They could put in their own money, companies could match it, and the funds could grow tax-deferred until retirement. And Ted Benna's idea was that this would be something on top of the pension, not a replacement for it. However, very quickly, many companies started to get rid of their pension plans and start offering 401ks. And by the 1980s, nearly half of large companies were offering 401k plans and getting rid of their pension plans. It was love at first sight, and the reasoning was simple. It transferred all the risk and responsibility from the employer to the employee. By giving a 401k, they no longer had a lifetime obligation for payment. It was predictable, they had more control, and it was marketed as a portable benefit where you could bring it anywhere. Also, Wall Street loved this idea as money started to pour into the stock market. And I know that you would all be very upset with me if I didn't mention that at this time, Ronald Reagan was president and embraced a new rhetoric of personal responsibility, anti-union, less government, and deregulation. And at a federal level, he embraced the idea of the 401k. And in 1986, he introduced the Thrift Savings Plan, which was a 401k style plan for federal workers, further embracing the idea of the 401k. But as the old system faded away, a new question emerged. What happens when retirement security depends entirely on the individual? And so let's talk about that in Chapter 5, The Wall Street Gamble. By the late 80s, the pensions were starting to disappear and be replaced by the 401k. And at first, workers didn't notice, but they were told they had more control over their retirement. And in the beginning, the 401k looked great because throughout the 90s, the stock market was booming and producing returns up to 33% in a single year, fueling confidence in this new system. But the cracks started to appear in the early 2000s with the dot-com bubble, where the NASDAQ lost 77% of its value in 3 years, crushing many people's retirement 401ks. And if you were planning to retire in those years, you were in big trouble. And many of these new 401k investors didn't know much about the stock market and how to choose the right investments, which led to some scandals. One in particular was the Enron scandal in 2001, where Enron encouraged workers to invest their 401ks in the company, leading them with portfolios heavily concentrated in Enron. And once the company ran into financial troubles, Enron froze their portfolios, making them unable to sell, and employees lost a huge chunk of their 401ks, making people see the dangers of overconcentration in government creating more regulation. The 401k led to a fundamental shift. Retirement security was no longer a promise from your employer, but it was a gamble you made on yourself. And your future depended on how much you saved, how you invested, and how the market performed. And even bigger cracks to this system started to appear in 2008 with the Great Recession, where the Dow dropped over 54% from its peak, killing people's 401ks, especially if they were planning on retiring during those years. But by the time the Great Recession hit, the transformation was complete. The pension system that once brought a lifetime security for millions had been replaced by a volatile, market-driven gamble. And while the 401k worked well with people with high incomes, financial literacy, and time on their side, it left millions of others vulnerable, one market crash away from watching their retirement dreams vanish. And so I want to finish this video off with Chapter 6, Where Do We Go From Here? All right, let's take a breath for a second. That was one hell of a story, wasn't it? I'm sure that's not the story you expected to hear when you clicked on this video, but the story of the vanishing pension is fascinating. We've seen it evolve from a tool of the industrial age to attract workers, then as a wartime loophole, a union bargaining chip in the 60s. Then we saw it unravel from mismanagement and corruption, get regulated, and ultimately be replaced by the 401k, creating today's volatile, market-driven retirement system that offers no real security. And so the question is, what do we do with all this information? Well, if there's just one thing this story teaches us, it's that retirement, just like life, is never as simple as we'd like it to be. The story of the vanishing pension isn't this quick rise and fall tale, but it's a reminder of how complex the systems that we rely on are and how they are constantly changing and are shaped by economics, politics, and human nature itself. And so instead of telling you what to do or what to believe, I just want to finish this video off telling you 3 takeaways that I personally got from researching this video. 1, nothing is black and white. When we look back at history, it's tempting to oversimplify things, to say that pensions died because corporations got greedy, or because the government failed, or because workers didn't fight hard enough. But the truth is, it was all of those things, but it was also none of them entirely. The rise and fall of the pension was a mix of good intentions, bad decisions, economic forces, and plain human nature. And it should be a reminder to all of us that real stories are always much more complicated than the headlines that are trying to divide us are portraying. 2, nothing is guaranteed. For decades, the pension was seen as untouchable, like this promise carved in stone. But promises are only as strong as the systems behind them, and systems can and will fail as long as humans are involved. Companies close, markets crash, laws change, and what feels secure today can vanish tomorrow. The truth is, no retirement plan or really anything in this world is guaranteed. And the quicker you can accept that reality, I think, the happier and less stressed you'll be. And finally, there is no final victory. When we look at the story of humanity, what we see is this narrative that just plays out over and over again. A problem occurs, progress is made, challenges are overcome, but then something happens and the cycle repeats itself. Over and over and over again. That's the way it's always been, and that's the way it's always going to be. Because we human beings are complex emotional creatures that will never get our shit together. And so I want to finish this video off with a quote that I think summarizes this entire story, and really the entire story of humanity. And this is how it goes. There is no final victory, and there is no final defeat. There is just the same fight to be fought, again and again and again. So toughen up. Thank you so much for watching. Doing these videos takes an immense amount of research and effort in my part. So if you enjoyed this video, it would mean the world to me. If you give it a like, subscribe for more videos like it. And if you want to hear a deep story about the evolution of retirement, give this video a watch next. And with that, muchas gracias. Que tenga un buen día. Nos vemos, chicos.